This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, I'm going to have Shabbos Rabbi. This past Wednesday we spoke about the life and times of Rav Dovid Nieto and the defense of the Chacham Tzvi. There's one particular sefer that Rav Dovid Nieto wrote. Again, Rav Dovid Nieto was the Abbezin of London. He came from Livorno. He was born in 1654. He passed away in 1728 on his 74th birthday on Chav Ches Teves. One of the most prominent, if not the most prominent sefer that Rav Dovid Nieto wrote, which really does not get the attention and the chashivas that it deserves, and it's one of the great svarim. The name of the sefer is Matei Dan, the staff of Dan. Dan being Dovid Nieto. It has another name. The other name of it is the Kuzari Hasheini, the second Kuzari. And on Wednesday we spoke out that the Chacham Tzvi in Shas Teshuvas Chacham Tzvi Simin Yurches praised the drasha of Rav Dovid Nieto and said that the idea that Teva is Hashem is not only not apikarsos, but it is required belief. And if you don't believe that nature is God, then that itself is apikarsos. What? That. Yeah, so Hateva is Elikim. So the Chida also in the Shem Hagdolim lists the Matei Dan as one of his recommended reading, one of the great svarim. There's an entry for the Matei Dan, Marenu Harav Dovid Nieto, the Abbezin of Kal Kadosh Bilondris in London, Lahachriach Amitos Torah Shebal Peh. The point of the Sefer is to prove the veracity of the oral law, Al Derech HaKuzari, in the same vein as the Kuzari, V'haya Chacham B'chachmas Philosoph. He was a great sage in philosophy, V'toichein, and in mechanics, V'chacham B'tashboiras, and in mathematics, Kuyotzei, V'amad Neged HaPoikrim, and he stood up against the Apikarsim, Kiyadua, as is known, and says the Chida in the Tshuvas of the Chacham Tzvi in Simin Yurches, he praises him. Now, I'm going to tell you an incredible thing. I have here the title page of two editions of the Sefer. We have the title page of the Warsaw edition, and that I got from Oitzar HaChachma. And in the title page, it brings down over here that there are three great Gedolim who support and vouch for the greatness of Rav Dovid Nieto. Number one, Haloi Hema Hagoin Rabin Shel Komnei Agoyla, the Chacham Tzvi, vouch for him. Number two, the Goyin HaMuvak, Rav Chaim Yosef David Azulai in the Shem HaGdolim, Imareches Mem Ois Tzadihei, and that's a Chida. And number three, incredibly, when the Sefer after it was published in London went out of print, none other than Hagoyin Rav Aryeh Leib. Who's Hagoyin Rav Aryeh Leib? The Shagas Aryeh. The Shagas Aryeh himself vouched for the godless of Rav Dovid Nieto. Not only did Rabbi Aryeh Leib Ginsburg, he was born in 1695, he lived till 1785, the Rav of Minsk. He started off he was the Rav in Metz. He started off in Pinsk, then later went to Minsk, and there was a big machlokes with Rabbi Chil Halpern, and he had to leave, and the legend has it when the Shagas Aryeh ran out of the city, he said, "What? Minsk isn't burning down yet?" Yeah. And sure enough, throughout history, there were many, many fires always in Minsk because of the Gnai. They didn't treat the Shagas Aryeh with proper respect. And his greatest sefer was the Shagas Aryeh. He became the Rav in Metz. There's another machlokes, and he refused to enter the shul except for 4 drushas he gave a year. Okay. Be it as it may, the Shagas Aryeh, who doesn't know Shagas Aryeh? Milanu Gadol me Shagas Aryeh. One of the last people you would expect to publish a sefer like the Kuzari Hasheini, and yet he had this sefer republished in Metz. Not only that, so we have over here the edition of the Warsaw edition in number 2, and the Chida himself brings down in number 1, Chashiva Sefer Matei Dan HaNizkar Hukam al Mizbeach Hatfus Mechadash Be'ir Metz Asher B'Tzarfas. They republished the Matei Dan in Metz, which is in France, with the Haskama of the Goyin, the Maifis Hadar, Reb Leib, Rashiva Metz. That's a reference to the Shagas Aryeh. So I have over here number 3. I was hoping get my hands on the edition of Matei Dan that was published in Metz, because I would have really loved to see the Haskama that the Shagas Aryeh gave to the Sefer. And lo and behold, it was not on the Yotzar HaChachma, but the Hebrew books had the edition published in Metz with the Haskama and the Cherem of the Shagas Aryeh. So what does that mean, the Haskama and the Cherem of the Shagas Aryeh? So first of all, he gave a Haskama to the Sefer, and he put a Cherem on anyone who would republish it other than these publishers, because back in the day, if you published a Sefer, it was a tremendous time and financial investment, and if somebody would come along soon after and republish it, so then the original publishers would lose their money. So he put an 8-year cherem on anyone who would republish the Sefer. 8 years. 8 years.
28.
So look at number 4. Here we have, incredibly, the Haskama and the cherem of Hagoyin Hagadol HaMeforsam, the Shagas Aryeh. And he says, Nimsa, these are the heilige words of the Shagas Aryeh. Nimsa ba'amtachas ben yamini ha-sefer nechmad matei dan ha-nikra Kuzari chelek sheni. I have in my pocket, in my sack, this manuscript of the Kuzari Sheni, which shows the path for the confused to the path of Emunah, and it adds knowledge, das, that the Chacham are noicha himenu, to destroy the tsaras, the baharas levana, the nigei b'nei adam, and more than the biur and the bitul chametz through the taruvos of the Torah Shebachsav, more even through the Kuzari Rishon, and the Kuzari Sheni adds various proofs on his own that the Torah Sheba'al Peh was given l'Moshe Sinai. As we're going to see, the focus of the Kuzari Sheni is to prove the veracity and the authenticity of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. V'oisa chizuk l'divrayim k'shel Torah b'mrei bina. And says the Shagas Aryeh, because this Sefer, Safu Tama Sefer Anal, v'lo nimtza b'ir afilu echad mimenu, you can't even find one of these Svarim in the city. And I searched to try to get a hold of it. And therefore, because it was not available, I recommended that it be republished, and in a beautiful way, and a beautiful paper, and a beautiful font. And therefore, they asked me for haskama and permission, so therefore I acceded to their request to have it republished in this Oifen HaMahudar, and so that the publishers do not lose out, and nobody should be Masa Gavul, and to steal from this publisher whose name was Nata, I put a cherem on anyone who publishes it within the next 8 years. So, incredibly, the Shagas Aryeh would not have vouched for a sefer like this if it was not of extreme importance. Now, it was published again by the Mossad Rav Kook, and in the Mossad Rav Kook edition, there are 2 very interesting things. There is a mavoi, which is like some kind of a foreword to the sefer, and in the back there's a biography. So the biography we read from on Wednesday, it was from a Dr. Beis Reish Vav Taf. So we weren't exactly sure who that is. That's Dr. Bezalel Roth, or known as Cecil Roth, the great historian. He actually wrote the Hebrew biography in the back of the edition. Cecil Roth wrote the history of the Jews. So he wrote a lot of books on history. He wrote the biography in the back of the Matei Dan Kuzari Sheni, and in the introduction you have what is called a mavoi from Rav Yud Lamed Maimon. Who is Rav Yud Lamed Maimon? Yehuda Leib Fishman, or later Maimon, was a Talmud of Rabbi Chil Michal Epstein, the Aruch HaShulchan. And so this Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon, you know who he is? He passed away in 1962 at 86 years old. He's the founder of the Mizrahi movement. And He was moved to Palestine in 1913, expelled during World War I. He came to the United States. He organized the Mizrahi movement, and he was a big supporter of Kook, and he helped establish the Rabbanit in Israel. Anyway, he was a scholar who was involved in publishing, and he printed this sort of introduction. He says over here, just an historical overview, and it's surprising to learn that besides this sefer, no other sefer was ever written to authenticate the Torah Sheba'al Peh. The only sefer ever written is focused on proving that the Torah Sheba'al Peh was Min HaShamayim is this sefer Mateidan Kuzari Sheni. Because I'll just give you a few examples of, he has an incredible hakdama that I want to go through on a different occasion. But, you ever notice that we lay in the Torah and somebody gets called up to an aliyah, and what bracha do they make when they step down? Asher nasan lanu Torahs emes v'chaye olam nata b'soichenu. Says the Torah, what does it mean, v'chaye olam nata b'soichenu? What does that refer to? Torah Sheba'al Peh. So here's the question. If that refers to Torah Sheba'al Peh, but you're not laning Torah Sheba'al Peh now, all you're doing is reading the Torah Sheba'al, why would you make a bracha, v'chaye olam nata b'soichenu? The answer is, because Kriyas HaTorah could be a great support for the Karam, because the Karam only believe in the Torah Sheba'al. And here it is, we're getting up publicly, and all we're doing is laning from the Torah Sheba'al. If we would get up and say, imagine if you had a Baal Koreh to say over Shas. So then, that would be a thorn in the sides of the Karam. But here it is, all we do is we publicly declare the importance of Torah Sheba'al. Therefore, Chazal specifically instituted that the bracha that you make is, Asher nazlan Torah Emes, v'chayelam nata b'soichenu. Another takana that they made. On Monday and Thursday, Yirot Tzem L'vnei Avinu Shebayim, L'kayim Banu Chachmei Yisrael, Heim Uvneim, right? Heim Uvneim, Heim Uvneim, V'Salmideim, V'Salmidei Talmideim, right? What are we talking about? Why are we all of a sudden davening and offering a tefillah on behalf of the Talmidei Chachamim and the Torah scholars? The answer is because Kriyas HaTorah is a tremendous support for the Karaim, and therefore, in order to protect ourselves from that, Chazal instituted a very specific tefillah that we daven for the Chachmei Yisrael. Heim unasheim uvneim uvneisem samidem samidei samidem chol mekayimos moishveiseim. But despite all of this, it's pointed out in number 5. Ein anu moitziim sefer miyuchad al amitas haTorah Sheba'al Peh. Rav Sadia Gaon was the only one who wrote svarim about this. They were all destroyed or burned by the Karaim. After him, many generations passed, and there's no sefer in Ivrit, in Lashon HaKodesh about it. Now, the point is, there are many svarim in other languages. Rav Moshe Chagiz in the sefer Sfas Emes, he writes on page 8, it's on the third line, the second column, number 5, that Pilpul was Niten l'Moshe Sinai, not like those klipos that speak foully about Pilpul. And he says, if somebody has any questions about the Torah Sheba'al Peh, you should go to the Svarim, 2 or 3 Svarim written by the Sephardim, who wrote a little bit about this in Spanish, in order to educate the people about the importance of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, because we don't want people who grew up among the Goyim to forget about the veracity of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Which Sfarim were written, says Rav Moshe Chagiz, the first Sefer written. Again, these are all Sfarim written, but not in Lashon Kodesh. The first Sefer written was the Sefer Conciliador. Who wrote the Conciliador? Menashe ben Israel, who is the great Chacham and the Rav Gadol of the Sephardic community. Menashe ben Israel, we mentioned, he went together with Rav Yaakov Saspartas to Oliver Cromwell to petition to allow the Jews back into England. Okay, and another sefer written about this was the Chacham Mariner Immanuel Abuhav. But these Svarim were all written in Lashon Zara. But be'ivris in Lashon HaKodesh, lo yizachinu l'sefer shiyah mukdash kol hichiach hamidas tar shebapeh, until one of the Gedolei Yisrael rose up in the 16th century, the 17th century. His name is Rav Dovid Nieto, the rabbi of the Sephardim in London, who wrote the Sefer Matei Dan. So it's written over here that the Sefer Matei Dan never got the accolades.
Kuzari 1.
The what?
Kuzari 1.
Kuzari 2. It's called Kuzari 2. Never got the chashivas that it deserved, but the author of this Mavei says, when I was a young man, I read and learned this Sefer many, many times. And through learning the Sefer, Nezgabra Belibi Yoiser V'Yoiser Ahav Tar Shebapeh, that only through Tar Shebapeh can we understand Tar Shebachsav. That's why throughout history, you see the Goyim are smarter than the Jews. The Jews, I like Chumash. I like doing Chumash. Yeah, what do you hear? Most people, they go to the Rabbeim and the Yeshivas. What's the most commonly asked question by people to Rabbeim and Yeshivas? Why don't you teach Navi? Right? You ask any Rabbi, they'll tell you, the biggest complaint they get, why don't you learn Navi? Why don't you learn Navi? And the real reason is because Yeshiva is a non-for-profit organization. That's the real reason. But that's why they don't learn Navi. But that's a big question. But the Goyim are very smart. Throughout history, when the Goyim burn our Torah, they don't go after the Bible. They're not interested in the Bible because they know that if the Jews only have the Bible, they will disappear. They only burn the Talmud because they know the Talmud is the Torah. Okay, be it as it may, let's get a little bit of the historical background. We'll start getting why Rav Dovid Nieto wrote this sefer, and then we'll do some of the meat and potatoes after it in the second shir. Look at number 6. This comes from the biography printed in the back of the Mossad Rav Kook edition. He says, you see, historically, you're dealing still in the aftermath of the Inquisition. So this is, we're talking the late 1600s, 1690s. Still 200 years after the Inquisition. But for generations, you've had many Jews who only secretly were able to keep Torah and mitzvahs, but openly they were practicing Christians. Their open studies were only in the Bible and the written law. That contributed to a neglect of the Talmud. Plus, there were so many burnings of the Talmud. Therefore, the importance of the Torah Sheba'al Peh got lost, and this is why Rav Dovid Nieto wrote the Sefer Matei Dan, Kuzari Sheni. It was first written in 1710, and it was publicized in 1714. It was in the same surah as the Kuzari Harishon. It's a dialogue between a Chacham and the king of the Kuzars. What?
How long ago before this one?
Before which one?
The first Kuzari.
700 years or so. No. So here we have the story of this Chacham who leaves his city in Venice, and he leaves Venice, and he goes to the king of the Kuzars, and they have this dialogue and they have this debate. And as opposed to the Kuzari Harishon, which primarily was upholding the divine origins of the Torah Shebachsav, Kuzari Sheni, as we mentioned, was focused primarily on the Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's brought over here that Rav Dovid Nieto saw in the Sefer Kuzari Sheni, he says, Ra b'Sefer zeh b'tzedek yitziras chayav. He felt that this really was a justification of his life. This was like his life's mission. This was the accomplishment of his life. Now, the Jewish printing press, we know there were printing presses in Italy. Were there printing presses in London? It was still in its early stages. And therefore they had to make special letters to print this Sefer, and he had to pay for it, because until then, no Sfarim were published ever in London. And, he printed the Sefer in 3 editions. They all came out simultaneously. The first one, Spanish, Sfaradis. Very difficult to get a hold of a copy of the original Sephardic Spanish version of the Sefer. The second one, only Hebrew. And a third edition, the Art Scroll version. where he had Hebrew on one side and Spanish on the other side.
Hard scroll.
Yeah.
He was in London at the time?
Yeah, he published it in London, yeah.
Didn't put it in English?
No, he was for his communities, and especially for the Spanish-Portuguese descent. And if you look on the title page, there's a medallion with an image of Moshe Rabbeinu, and this is part of the artwork of Rav Dovid Nieto. Okay, so let's start the Hakdama, and you're going to see what sort of prompted him to write this sefer. He gives you a historical account. He says, the Fanim Bi Yisrael, number 7, when Hashem ruled on Har Tzion, and Hashem was acknowledged in the world through his prophets and his Chachamim, and God's pure words were delved upon, and everybody valued each word of Torah like gold and silver. On the 4th line, everyone's eyes were turned to the Sanhedrin Gedolah, the Amudei HaKabbalah, the supporters of Torah, and whatever the Sanhedrin HaGedolah would say, there was no dispute. And there was no machloikes in the Beis Medrash, and there was no milchama. The authority of the Torah and the smooth and clear transmission of Torah was absolute. Because any question was posed to the Sanhedrin Gedolah, and they issued a psak, and Ve'elav Tishmon. From the day that God made his voice heard on Har Sinai, B'koiloi Subrakim Va'anam Kavod, and he said, Anoich V'layicha, the Torah and the Torah Shabbat Peh was passed down from generation to generation with a flawless transmission until the Tsaras broke out. What was the leprosy? The leprosy was 2 individuals by the name of Tzadok and Baitos in the times of the Hasheini, Talmidim who argued on the Rabbi, Avadim that broke away, they threw off the Omachos Shamayim, and now the Tsaras spreads to the walls of the house. Okay. Then Klal Yisrael broke up into different groups, and this is the beginning of the end of the transmission, sort of the Torah, because the force of the Tzedokim spread its way over a large segment of Klal Yisrael, and even after the Prushim prevailed over them, and we subdued them, but nevertheless the moisture and the remnant of the Tzedokim remained until the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. In fact, if you don't mind, if you look in the Gemara in Gittin, and this is a very important yediyah, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai snuck out of the city, and they told him, make 3 requests. So what did Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai ask for? Yavne v'chameh, and a Rebbe and a doctor for Rav Tzadok. And what else did he ask for? And the line of descent of Ram Gamliel. So Rabbi Yosef said, what happened here? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai made a big mistake. He should have asked, this is a fulfillment of Meishiv Chachamim Achar. He should have said, leave this city. Leave Yerushalayim. Don't destroy the Beis HaMikdash. But he held, no. Kulei hai loy avid. V'hatzola portanami loy hava. However, the fact that the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed was a big salvation for Klal Yisrael. Why? Because with the destruction of Yerushalayim and the Beis HaMikdash came the destruction of the Tzedokim and the Baitisim. And let's say nothing more than, even if you analyze certain tragedies that happened in more recent times, as tragic as they were and as many lives as they took, there were certain movements that died with it as well. And some would say that as disastrous as it was, but the future of Klal Yisrael was also at stake. There are certain movements that also went down in Europe. unfortunately, with all the Kedoshim. So this is a certain parallel in history that the Gemara discusses. What do you do when you have a snake coiled around a jar? Do you have to just smash everything? Or sometimes it's possible to get a tongue and just remove the snake, but not so easy. It's not so easy. But be it as it may, says Rav Dovid Nieto, with the tiltal and the pizor, so together he says, "Im kozeh ara shagala yikarenu v'nuta kohen beis chayinu asafu tamu gam heim mi bahalois hapizar." Then went down the tzedakah and the baitusim. And our nechama in the bitter galus is that throughout the first 1,000 years or so, because actually throughout the first, not 1,000 years, but for the first part of our galus in the times of the Mishnah and Shas, through the times of the Mishnah and Shas, Klal Yisrael, the overwhelming majority of them, stood up for and abided by the authority of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Comes the year Daled Alafim Taf Kuf Beis. That's the year 4,502. Okay? So we're talking about 1,200 years ago. Approximately 8th century. There were two individuals who are not well known. Their names were Anan and Shaul. Anan and Shaul. Shaul ben Anan was the Karaite Jewish leader of the 8th century. And they, again, sort of fueled the fire, stoked the coals of the movement of the Tzedokim and Baitusim, only to believe in the Torah Shebechsav. And Rav Dovid Nieto therefore says, since that time, there was always challengers against the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and that's the function of the Sefer Matedan Kuzari Sheni. So take a look in this third paragraph in number 7. He says, Ve'im ha'emes atem she'ein lanu elamasha kasa b'Torah. If you're going to take the Torah literally and only accept the divinity of the written law, halayhem yoreinu yomruli. So please tell me, Lama David HaMelech HaChassid V'HaKadosh Lufnei Hashem Yishbach Sicha Leimar Hayreini Hashem Derech Chukecha. Why is David HaMelech beseech God, Hashem, please teach me your statutes. Havineni, help me understand them. Ve'etzreim terzach, so I should guard your Torah. Havineni ve'alamda mitzvaysecha. Avdechani, havineni. Well, it's not rocket science. It says, work for 6 days, rest on the 7th. What is this plead of David HaMelech? Then Hashem should help him understand the Torah. The Torah is black and white. He didn't know how to read the pasuk. David HaMelech needed Aleph Beis lessons. That he's asking God to help him learn the Torah. You have kids that know the entire Torah Sheba'al Peh. You don't think David HaMelech knew it? So what's David HaMelech asking for? God, teach me the Torah. What, he's a complete... He has learning difficulties. He's challenged. What's the question? The answer is because the Torah Sheba'al Peh is so vast. Meaning he's trying to prove that in the times of David HaMelech, there was Torah Sheba'al Peh. Also, says Rav Dovid Nieto, it says 7 days eat matzos, but then it says Sheishas Yomim Teicha matzos. Could someone please tell me, how in the world do you understand the book? Then it says, don't shecht the Karm Pesach when there's chametz. That sounds like you don't eat chametz Erev Pesach. Then it says, Ach b'yom harishon tashbisu. That sounds like only the first day. Even the stories in the Torah we don't understand without a Torah Sheba'al Peh. For example, it says by the Bris Ben HaMasarim, Va'avodim v'inu oisam, what? Arba me'os shana. But then it says, U'moshe b'nei Yisrael she'yosh b'zayim shloishim z'araba me'os shana. It says, Va'asulam tzitzis. I have a question for you. Do you have any clue what that means? Va'asulahem tzitzis. Make tzitzis. So what do? How do you make it? Gedilim tasacha. Make tassels. So maybe you should go to Johnston and Murphy and get yourself a nice pair of those tasseled shoes. But still, I don't know, black, brown. So what? It depends. In Flatbush, black. In the Five Towns, brown. What's the mitzvah? What's the mitzvah? How am I supposed to know? My father likes to say over, it says that Rosh Hashanah should be a day of blowing. Now what?
Every day is a day of blowing.
What do you mean, day of blowing? Blowing your nose? Maybe you should drive into the synagogue, BMW, honk the horns, day of blowing. That's all the Torah says. Or the Torah says, Al Yetzei Ish Mimakaymai B'yayim HaShvi. Don't move. What's your Makaymai? If it's Kipshutai, you wouldn't be allowed to leave your house. Then he has a Gavaldiga Kasha. It says, Vayimtzu Ish Mekoishesh Eitzim Yom HaShabbos. So they took the Mekoishesh out for Misa. But wait a second. But who found him? Well, the guys who found him, they were Yetzim Mimakaymai. So they should have killed them also. Elamadi was clearly in oral law that Al Yitzis Mimakaymai was Dalit Amos of carrying Rishus Harabim or Tchum Shabbos. These are one of thousands of clear proofs that there was a Torah Shabbat, and therefore Dovid begs Hashem, Lamdeini Chukecha. And says Rav Dovid Nieto, if somebody's going to ask me, okay, I know there's a Torah Shabbat Peh, but what gave these rabbis the audacity to come along and be the ones to expound and explain? So thank you very much. That's why I wrote my Sefer. So read my book, and then you'll tell me if you have any questions when you're done. And it's based on the two Eidim, Shnayim Eidim, the two Eidim who, in their derech, the derech of Rishonim, the derech of Rishonim, to speak in a very general way, and that is the Rambam and the Ravid. The Rambam in the Hakdama to the Perish HaMishnah, and the Ravid in the Hakdama to the Sefer HaKabbalah. And he says, as follows. And if somebody who wants to be an apikaris, he wants to say, well, why are there so many machloikas in the Gemara? So knock out this guy's teeth. Why? Because there's kemat no machloikas in the Gemara. What do I mean? Nobody argues whether you light the candles Friday night. There's no machloikas. I call moedim madlikin saneres. The only shayla is bameh madlikin. Nobody argues whether you say Shema, Avad you say Shema. The question, Me'ima Saikar Shema. So there is a presupposition of granted and something and ideas that everybody accepts. The arguments are on the minutiae, on the detail. And he says, whatever I'm writing is just a commentary on the Ram and the Ravid, because these great luminaries whose hearts were open like Kepischa Shel Ulam, they were able just to write the generalities. However, in our lowly generation, it's necessary to expound on more of the details, and what I'm doing is just elaborating on the words of the Rambam. And therefore, he says, I call my Sefer Mate Done, which we will continue the part 2 after the break. Shkoyach. Let's meet up in 4 minutes. Yeah?
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.